The topic and title of this video is Epistemology in the Gym. This topic is an example of practical epistemology, meaning you can apply it to your everyday life very quickly. So let's start this way. Beliefs should have probability. You should be able to assign probability to your belief, at least roughly. And it's not going to be necessarily a correct probability, but it's a good way to use beliefs. Because at a certain point, if the probability of a belief is high enough, it should be so high that you should act on the belief. Or if it's lower, not high enough to act on, you'll still consider it. Maybe it'll be a probability that makes you want to learn more about the subject and see if you can raise that probability high enough so that you can act on that belief. Two topics in this video. One purpose is to help you evaluate the potential truths you've heard and claims you've heard about training or diet or movement patterns and help you evaluate them. And two, to help you decide when it's appropriate to incorporate those claims into your life. In this video, I'm not claiming to be an expert in anything exercise or diet related. I'm not commenting on specific movement patterns, diets, or programming. What I am commenting on is epistemology and how we can figure out for ourselves what is true, what is not, when should we incorporate something that we've heard. So in this video, I'm going to discuss 3 justifications for choosing to incorporate a claim into your training routine. Just a little back information. A claim is an assertion of truth. It can be true or false. Every claim requires a justification. A justification can be good or bad apart from the claim. You know, the claim could be true, but the justification might be not good. So we're going to talk about 3 methods of justification. These aren't necessarily official justifications in epistemology. They're just practical ways to justify things in the gym or in your running routine. So in this video, I will be using the example of a gym and resistance training, but you can apply this to running, weightlifting, powerlifting, sprinting, baseball, whatever you want. I'm talking about the epistemology of justifications in the physical world. So if you spend some time at the gym, you may have had a bro politely come up to you and correct your form, recommend diet changes, or maybe programming changes to your exercises. Or if you spend some time online looking at different information, you'll see a lot of differing opinions on diet and fitness, and it's an extremely diverse and often contentious amount of differing opinions on food and training. Now, I think I already mentioned this, but just to go over it again, there's 3 justifications we're going to be talking about that will allow you to determine whether you should incorporate a claim or a potential truth into your training routine or diet or sport training. Those justifications are science, anecdote, and mechanisms. Let's start off talking about the science justification. So when I say science, we're specifically talking about scientific studies. What a scientific study is well, let's talk about like a interventional study. Okay, what you do is you take 20 people, 10 of them take a lot of creatine in specific doses at specific times. The other 10 don't take any creatine, and then you have both groups, perform 1 rep max on bench press or 5 rep max on bench press, before taking creatine and after taking creatine. Or for the group not taking creatine, you would give them a placebo. So a con of using scientific studies is that humans vary considerably in biology and biomechanics. And what scientific studies do is they find the average truth of the average person. At least for exercise science, they find what on average works for the average person. But you might be, what's called an outlier. So it's not necessarily going to work for you. It's going to work for the average person, but there's a chance it won't work for you, even if it's supported extremely well in the scientific data. Another con of using scientific studies as a justification for incorporating claims into your training is the conclusions of the studies are often wrong. The data itself might not really support the conclusion that is generally drawn from it in the public or what the conclusion actually says in the scientific paper. Or maybe it's just not a replicable study, It was a very small sample size, and by chance, they got it wrong. The pros of scientific study is that they're excellent averages. It's a very good way to find what is objectively and on average true. So if there's something that's really well supported by lots of good scientific data, then odds are it's going to work for you. Another pro is it's the best system we have for accumulating and deciphering mass truth. People put a lot of effort into science, into scientific study. It's something that you can generally trust. Now we're going to talk about anecdotes. Right now we're going to talk about using your own anecdotes. If you notice that you do an intervention, you change your form on a particular exercise or a movement, and all of a sudden your results, the outcome is much better. Well, that's just an anecdote, which gets a lot of flack. When you hear anecdote, you might think of it negatively, but in this case, an anecdote would be very valuable because the anecdote is hyper specific to you. You change your form, your bench shot way up. You're lifting way more in a specific movement. So that's a valuable anecdote, and you should probably incorporate that possible truth into your training. Another pro of anecdotes is they can be empirical. You see it with your own eyes. A con of anecdotes is that they're rarely a reliable way to suggest things to another person because we're also different. So let's say you change your form a little bit on a particular movement. That helps you out a lot. And then you go and suggest someone else should make that change their form. That's usually not a good idea. Humans are vastly different in their biomechanics and their movement patterns. We look pretty similar, but small changes in like muscle bone connection points, ligaments, tendons, segment links can really add up and cause the biomechanics of someone to be considerably different. So just because something works for you really doesn't mean it's going to work for someone else. Anecdotes are great for yourself, though. Another con of anecdotes is they can easily be subject to many different biases. So with the scientific method, they're specifically doing trials where they are aware of all the possible fallacies and biases that could arise, and they do their best to get rid of them. It's harder to do that with anecdotes. You could fall prey to the confirmation bias. You already believe something, you try something out, it seems to work. That's confirmation bias. There's a false cause fallacy. Correlation is not causation. And a really bad one that I see happen a lot is apophenia. What apophenia is our tendency to see patterns where there are none. All right, now we're going to talk about mechanisms as justifications for incorporating a claim into your training routine. There are no pros to mechanisms. I am not a fan of mechanisms. I've talked about on this YouTube channel before, I do not like mechanistic only justifications. So I'm just going to mention one con. Biology is too complicated to rely on mechanisms. So if you say, oh, that makes sense because your body works this way, it's like, okay, well, there's like 300 other things that you may not be considering. So it's just like not a good reason to believe that something will work for you. So generally, I would say when you're choosing programming, movements, and food, and trying to decide what to do basically in your physical life, in your physical training, my suggestion: start with science. Look at the scientific data, the scientific studies. They can often be boring. We should all probably be reading the entire study. I know I rarely do that. At least read the abstract and the discussion and conclusion. If you can't do that, find a source that you trust who does research breakdowns, and listen to that podcast or that research breakdown on that blog, whatever it is. So you start with the science. Then, if the science appears to be good, you do a study with an N of 1, meaning that's just really just an anecdote, but you try and control for variables, you try and do everything else the same, but then you make this one intervention that you think is supported in the science, see if it works for you. If it works for you, probably incorporate that into your training. So now let's talk about giving advice to other people, and whether you're a trainer or you're a content producer, or you're just giving advice to your friends or acquaintances in the gym. When giving advice to other people, whether it's your client, a friend, or an acquaintance, only use science as a justification. Here's why. You could use anecdotes, but anecdotes, as we discussed, they're applying to yourself only. You notice that in their self-network. And we already talked about the human body is extremely variable in sports science. So it's unlikely that just because something works for you, it's going to work for someone else. So you're probably doing more harm than good by telling them that, oh, because this worked for me, it's going to work for you. Generally, that's not a good idea. if you're using an anecdote, make sure they know you're just telling a story. You know, it's something to try. Hey, it worked for me. I don't know if it'll work for you. It's just a story. Don't use mechanisms either, because mechanisms are terrible always. I mean, mechanisms can serve as tiebreakers. You know, if you have two interventions that you could do and they are mutually exclusive, then I suppose you could use mechanisms to say, like, oh, this one makes more sense. All right, now we're going to go through a few examples and show you in these examples how you could use these three levels of justifications: science, anecdote, and mechanisms, to determine whether to incorporate that claim into your training. First example, a bro comes up to you in the gym when you're deadlifting. He says, bro, you shouldn't round your back so much during the deadlift, because you were rounding your back a little bit in the deadlift. Okay, you say, thank you very much. I appreciate the advice. And you think about it, you're like, yeah, okay, I was looking at videos of myself deadlifting, my back does round a little bit. You do some research, find some studies online, find some meta-analyses, hopefully, and you find, wow, I expected that rounding my back in deadlift was probably not a good idea, but the science doesn't really support it. Rounding your back in deadlift doesn't contribute more to injury. I've tried rounding my back less in the deadlift, and it just doesn't work for me. I lift so much less, it feels worse. And the science specifically reports that it doesn't increase your risk of injury. There's no evidence of that. So I'm going to continue to round my back a little bit in the deadlift. Yeah, I'm not worried. And so you'd make the decision in that manner. Second example. Once again, bro comes up to you, best intentions, I'm sure, says, you shouldn't wear your belt so much, during your squats, or you'll have weaker abs. I go like, oh, okay, I mean, sure, that could make sense. I could come up with a few mechanisms for that to make sense. So you do some studying online. Once again, you find actually belts, there's mild evidence to suggest that belts make rectus abdominis activity in the EEG stronger, actually. So belts actually probably make your abs a little bit stronger. You also like wearing a belt. It seems to make you stronger. So you're going to continue wearing a belt in 80% of your training. That's fine. So that was a good way to figure out this bro, was his claim good or not? Am I going to incorporate it? How much attention should I pay to it? Third example. You're reading these studies. You're reading meta-analysis about creatine. You're like, wow, creatine is like the gold standard for supplements. This is amazing how well it works. So you take creatine, load up on it. It does not work for you. It makes your stomach upset. You have digestion problems. You try it for a month, and it just does not work at all. You don't need to take it. Just because the scientific data supports something, that means it supports it on average for the average person. And there are outliers, and in these studies, there are outliers too. In this case, if you're an non-responder, that's probably because you already have accurate, full levels of phosphocreatine and creatine because you eat a lot of beef or something. So in that case, it would be fine. Scientific data says creatine helps. It helps a lot. It's the best supplement out there. Doesn't work for you? That's fine. Don't take it. It doesn't work for you. So in this case, anecdote outweighs science, right? Fourth example. Bro comes up to you, hey, I got this cool supplement. It works so good. It's amazing. He gives a terrible mechanistic explanation for it. He says, he says, oh, this works because blah, blah, blah. And it's a horrible mechanistic explanation. It's embarrassing listening to, but you're like, hey, okay, I got some downtime after the gym. I'm going to look this up. And you look it up, and there's been a lot of studies on this supplement that he suggested to you. And the supplement does not work at all. Absolutely not. But you're like, hey, what the heck? I'm going to try it anyways. So you try it, and it does amazing things for you. So in that case, what should you do? His mechanistic explanation was terrible. There is no mechanism for it, and the science doesn't support it. The science says it does not work, but it works for you. I'd say if you have reason to believe that it's not a dangerous supplement, then go ahead and take it because it works for you. This is an example of anecdote outweighing mechanisms and science in this case. Fifth and last example. Your trainer says to change your bench setup to avoid pain in your shoulders because you've been having some pain in your shoulders. You ask him why, and he gives you a mechanistic explanation. It's a decent mechanistic explanation, but you're wary of mechanistic explanations because you watched this video. There's also no scientific evidence for it. As you do some research and talk to your trainer as well, he doesn't even have an anecdote for it because he doesn't bench for some reason. But you try it, and it works. So in this case, the mechanism-based explanation worked. That doesn't necessarily mean his mechanism is true. Hopefully it is, but it was worth a try. You heard the mechanistic explanation, it made sense. You're like, sure, I'll give it a shot. And then this anecdote proved to you that it works, and so you incorporate this new bench setup into your bench press training. So I provided these examples to show that there's a place for mechanisms, for anecdotes, and for science, and depending on the circumstances, they can outweigh each other. Mechanisms should never outweigh anecdote or science, but every other possibility is possible in real life. When providing advice, you should only be using science. You could mention anecdotes, but make sure they know their anecdotes. You should not value the anecdote as it relates to their training very much at all. It has very low weight. Now, when receiving advice, keep in mind that just because someone provides a poor justification for their claim does not mean that it's wrong. There's something called the fallacy fallacy, and that's similar to this scenario. The fallacy fallacy is where someone uses a fallacy in their explanation of something, and you choose to not believe it because they used a fallacy. And that itself is a fallacy. So just because someone uses a bad justification does not mean that the claim is wrong. A broken clock is right twice a day. It's coincidentally right. Just like this bro or the trainer at the gym might be right, even though his justification is poor. Generally, you probably wouldn't choose to incorporate the claim. You might, it just depends on the circumstances and what the claim is, but you might choose to try it out, even though the justification is bad. When providing advice, value science over anecdotes and anecdotes over mechanism. When incorporating something into your training, evaluating evidence for yourself, receiving advice, generally start with the science, but try it out and then value anecdotes over science. Mechanisms can serve as tiebreakers.